The air in the library of forgotten studies didn't smell like old paper and dust, but like cold copper and ozone. This was the basement archive, a labyrinth of pneumatic shelving units and files so classified they didn't even have numerical codes, just cryptic sigils embossed on heavy, lead-lined folders. Dr. Elara Vance, a disgraced linguistic anthropologist now specializing in unstructured semantic phenomena, was chasing a ghost, an academic urban legend about a manuscript known only as the Zero Draft. It was said to be the precursor to every major occult text, a document so purely conceptual that reading it didn't just convey information, but rewrote the reader's perception of reality. Most believed it was a romanticized myth, a null point where language failed. Elara was a cynic, but a desperate one. Losing her tenure over her radical theories about precognitive grammar had left her with nothing but a government grant to categorize linguistic anomalies for the Department of Homeland Security, a euphemism for the weird, untranslatable nonsense spat out by fringe cults and deep web AI experiments. She found it not in a folder, but wedged behind a rarely accessed mechanical shelf, almost as if the library itself had tried to hide it. It wasn't a manuscript. It was a single object, wrapped in dried, brittle human skin. It was a cube made of a material she couldn't identify. It felt impossibly heavy and radiated a palpable, deep cold that made her teeth ache. The cold wasn't physical, it was a lack of heat, a localized void of energy. Etched into the cube's 6 faces were 6 complex, nonsensical characters that resembled a blend of archaic Sumerian and corrupted circuit diagrams. They seemed to shimmer when she looked at them directly, like heat hatch. As Elara's fingers closed around the artifact, the basement archive went silent. The faint mechanical whirring of the HVAC system, the hum of the fluorescent lights, everything cut out instantly. It wasn't a power failure, it was an erasure of sound. Then, the echo began. It wasn't a sound bouncing off a wall. It was a perfect, crystalline replica of a sound that hadn't been made yet, and it resonated deep in her temporal lobe. FF400 AA and 8DD days. The voice was synthesized, hollow, androgynous, spoken in perfect, unaccented English, yet somehow felt as ancient as stone. It was a single, repeating phrase, a prophecy, a countdown, or perhaps just static. She dropped the cube in a shock of adrenaline and revulsion. The moment it hit the dusty concrete floor, the normal sounds of the archive slammed back on, a deafening cacophony. The cube, however, was no longer on the floor. It was now floating 3 inches above the ground, spinning slowly. And on one of its faces, the 6 impossible symbols were now 5. One had been activated, or consumed. Elara didn't know what she had found, but the linguistic part of her brain, the part that had gotten her fired, screamed a horrifying realization: this wasn't a text that rewrote reality. This was a grammar bomb. And the countdown had just started. She knew then that she couldn't alert the authorities. She had to study it, translate it, and neutralize the thing before its silent, systematic destruction of meaning reached critical mass. She grabbed the cube, ignoring the crushing cold, and fled the archive, the chilling, prophetic whisper of the null point ringing in her mind. FF400A and 8DD days. Elara kept the cube in a temporary containment unit she'd cobbled together in her basement lab, a repurposed Faraday cage lined with thin sheets of mu-metal, designed to block electromagnetic fields. It did nothing to block the null point artifact. The cube just floated serenely inside its metallic prison, its impossible weight defying gravity, radiating that profound, non-physical cold. The first 5 days were spent on frantic, caffeine-fueled analysis. She tried spectroscopic analysis. The cube's composition registered as error, unknown density mass, across 3 different machines. She tried thermal imaging. It appeared as a patch of absolute, localized blackness, registering a theoretical temperature of 0 Kelvin, yet the air around it was comfortably room temperature. The remaining 5 symbols on its faces mocked her. They didn't belong to any known language family. They were too complex to be simple glyphs, yet too disorganized to be a systematic alphabet. They behaved like a corrupted syntax, a language attempting to fail. On the 6th night, she experienced the first logic gap. Elara was making a detailed 3D scan of the artifact, cross-referencing its dimensional data with patterns found in her research on deep web thought forms. She reached for her coffee mug, the one she distinctly remembered filling 5 minutes ago, and it was gone. She searched the desk, the floor, and the surrounding shelves. Nothing. Annoying, but not impossible. Maybe she'd left it in the kitchen. She went upstairs. It wasn't there either. Puzzled, she returned to the lab. The coffee mug was back on her desk, exactly where she'd expected it to be. It was lukewarm, half full, and the condensation ring on the blotter paper was fresh. This wasn't a memory lapse. It was an erasure and reinstatement of a small, trivial truth. The logic gaps became more frequent, escalating from missing objects to subtle contradictions in the physical world. A book she was certain she owned, a key text on ancient ritual geometry, was not in her library, and when she searched her purchase history, the record of its acquisition was absent. Not deleted, just never existent. The countdown continued, its chilling, intermittent whisper from the cage, louder now in the silent hours, FF400A and TT2DD days. Elara realized the truth. The cube wasn't just floating. It was slowly removing the linguistic frameworks that hold reality together. The first symbols, consumption, had erased the concept of 408 days being a precise measurement of time, replacing it with the chilling, echoing count. Now, the next symbol was clearly preparing to collapse a new category. A breakthrough came when she stopped treating the symbols as letters or words and started treating them as operators, linguistic functions. She theorized that each of the 6 faces represented a fundamental axis of human perception: time, space, identity, causality, logic, and self. She connected her analysis software to a highly directional microphone pointed at the cube, hoping to capture more data from the whisper. She isolated the repeating phrase and ran it through a series of filters. Suddenly, the synthesized voice cut through the static with terrifying clarity, speaking a full sentence, not the fragment she had heard before. It was a secondary, hidden message layered beneath the countdown. The cube is the key to the lock of universal agreement. A, and the lock is held by the O Outlier. Just as the sentence finished, The second symbol on the cube's face vanished in a silent flash of white light. The power in the entire city block immediately flickered, a rolling brownout. When the lights stabilized, Elara looked back at her desk. Her name, Dr. Elara Vance, was still embossed on her institutional ID badge. But the academic paper she was writing, saved under the file name Vance_null_theory_draft.pdf, now belonged to Dr. Elara Vance. The logic gap was no longer trivial. Her identity, her name, was being subtly rewritten. The second symbol, the axis of identity, had been consumed. And now, she knew the terrifying endgame: 5 more symbols, 5 more fundamental anchors of reality, would be dismantled. She typed a frantic note into her computer. Need to find the outlier and understand what lock of universal agreement means before I lose the ability to trust my own memory. The cube, now with 4 symbols remaining, began its echoing count again. FF400A and 1 DD day. Elara spent the next 2 weeks frantically searching for the terms lock of universal agreement and the outlier across every classified database her clearance allowed and every fringe dark web archive she could access. She was racing against the countdown, terrified of the next logic gap. The third symbol on the cube, which she hypothesized governed space, was beginning to glow faintly, pulsing with the beat of the distant, hollow countdown, TT300A and 91 DD days. Her search finally yielded a result, hidden within a declassified 1960s CIA file on psycholinguistic warfare. The file was heavily redacted, but one passage remained intact, referencing a shadowy program, Operation Anchor. The anchor is the consensus reality, the agreed-upon set of rules, the lock of universal agreement that prevents ontological collapse. When an outlier event is detected, a person or object whose presence fundamentally contradicts the anchor, the O protocol is initiated to neutralize or contain the threat before a null point cascade. The file detailed the single documented historical outlier event, which occurred in 1947, the mysterious disappearance of physicist Dr. Silas Thorne. Dr. Thorne was not known for his physics, but for his radical philosophical papers claiming that the concept of location was merely a linguistic construct, and that if one could break the syntax of spatial description, one could simply be elsewhere. Just before his disappearance, his personal diary, the only surviving artifact, was recovered. Elara located Thorne's diary in a high-security vault at the Library of Forgotten Studies, the same place she found the cube. She managed to pull strings with her DHS grant, claiming she needed to study Thorne's anomalous handwriting for her linguistic project. The diary was a disaster of the mind, a testament to unraveling sanity. But hidden within the paranoid ramblings were clear references to the cube. Thorne called it the siphon, the thing that drank meaning. One entry, dated hours before his disappearance, chilled Elara to the bone. The siphon demands truth, but the truth it demands is not knowledge, it is agreement. It is removing the axioms we all tacitly agree upon. I have seen the third glyph activate. The rules of 3-dimensional space are becoming optional. The walls of my study are folding. The siphon needs to be fed something that breaks the rules, an outlier, to reset the cascade, to turn its focus away from the anchor. Thorne's last coherent entry was a single, cryptic address in rural New Hampshire, followed by a drawing of a complex, interlocking symbol. 49 Blackwood Road. Find the point where two realities touch. Elara suddenly understood the horrifying logic. The siphon, the cube, was feeding on the universally agreed upon rules of reality, the anchor. To stop it, she couldn't destroy it, she had to distract it by offering it a new, potent source of broken agreement, an outlier. But who was the outlier? Was it Thorne, or someone he had hidden? As she secured the diary, a profound and horrifying logic gap manifested. The security guard stationed outside the vault, a man she had spoken to for 5 minutes about the weather, looked at her with blank indifference. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. "No, Officer Jones. I'm just leaving." "My name is Harris," he corrected, his brow furrowed. "And I don't believe we've met." Elara's heart hammered. Not only had his identity, symbol too, been retroactively changed, but her own memory, her personal, internal record of causality, was now contradicted by an external source. The third symbol on the cube in her backpack, the one for space, began to hum loudly, a high-pitched, almost musical drone. Elara knew she had no more time to analyze. The next collapse was imminent. She had to drive to New Hampshire, to 49 Blackwood Road, and find what Silas Thorne had hidden there, the real outlier. She felt the first manifestation of the spatial collapse as she left the library. The street she usually took home was gone. Not blocked off, but linguistically invalid. It had been replaced by a long, winding alleyway that smelled of burning copper and seemed to contain the light of 3 different suns. She looked over her shoulder, convinced the walls of the city were beginning to fold. The drive to New Hampshire was a nightmare of subtle, unnerving spatial dislocations. Elara found herself taking turns that led to impossible sequences of scenery. She would drive north for 10 minutes, only to find the sun setting over her left shoulder, an orientation that defied geography. The roads weren't just long, they seemed to contain more distance than they should, as if the concept of the mile had been stretched. The countdown, a phantom echo in her skull, dropped another day, TT 300A and 82 DD days. 49 Blackwood Road was deep in the heavily forested, isolated region of the state. When Elara finally arrived, she found not a house, but an absence. The address pointed to a clearing in a dense ring of ancient, unnaturally black pines. In the center of the clearing was a perfectly circular patch of bare, scorched earth about 30 feet in diameter. It looked like a building had been vaporized, except there were no debris, no foundation, and the grass surrounding the circle cut off with impossible sharpness. It was a hole in the landscape that shouldn't exist. Elara recognized the subtle, chilling signature of the null point effect. Dr. Silas Thorne hadn't just disappeared. He had linguistically erased the physical location of his home before the cube's third symbol, space, was fully activated. She pulled out Thorne's diary, cross-referencing the address with his final drawing, the complex, interlocking symbol. It wasn't a warning, it was a key. She realized the symbol was a topological map, a set of instructions for a precise, spatial violation. The symbol required 6 anchor points. Elara looked at the circle of scorched earth. It had no anchors. It was a blank slate. She then noticed the trees. The ring of pines around the clearing were all precisely the same height, and all their branches interlocked to form a nearly perfect dome over the scorched earth. More chillingly, Elara saw that every pine was marked at its base with a small, weathered stone, and there were exactly 6 of them, forming a hexagon around the void. Following Thorne's diagram, Elara moved to the first stone. The diary stated, "To unanchor the space, you must re-anchor the meaning." She pulled out her equipment, a sophisticated directional microphone, a high-frequency acoustic emitter, and a small, antique music box she'd brought as an emergency focus object. At each of the 6 stones, Elara performed a linguistic ritual based on Thorne's fractured notes. She didn't use language, she used sound as pure frequency and intent. She played the music box, then used the acoustic emitter to play a specific, complex tone, a dissonance that her linguistic software identified as a semantic contradiction. As the 6th tone faded, the air above the scorched earth grew heavy, viscous, and dark. It began to shimmer, not with heat, but with an optical illusion of depth, as if the light was folding in on itself. Then, with a grinding, metallic groan that felt wrong to the ear, an outline materialized. It wasn't the house. It was the negative space of the house. A perfect, 3-story Victorian structure made not of wood or stone, but of shadow and pure stillness. The house was a hole in the reality of the clearing. It was the true location of the Outlier. The null point cube in Elara's backpack gave off a blinding flash of white light. The hum that had been emanating from it peaked, almost shattering her teeth. The 3rd symbol, space, was gone. The resulting logic gap was instantaneous and terrifying. Elara was standing outside the shadow house, her feet rooted in the scorched earth. But she suddenly found herself looking down at her own body from 3 feet to the left, seeing the top of her head, the parting of her hair. She was seeing herself from a perspective that defied the single-point perception of space she had always taken for granted. Her personal perspective snapped back instantly, but the world was subtly, horribly different. The concepts of up and down were less fixed. She took a step, and for a horrible second, felt the pull of gravity shift sideways. The cube, now with 3 symbols remaining, began its echoing count. This time, the silence before the word was longer, the static louder. TT 300 AA and 65 DD days. CC Causality is NN next. Elara knew she couldn't hesitate. The shadow house, the perfect spatial void, was now fully manifested. She had crossed the threshold of a logic gap that would quickly tear apart the physical world. She reached out and pushed the door, a door made of thick, frozen darkness, and stepped inside to find the Outlier. Stepping inside the shadow house was like plunging into a cold, perfectly silent pool. The air was heavy, and the light, which seemed to originate from nowhere, was a flat, sickly grey. The walls were not made of wood or plaster, but of a substance that absorbed all ambient noise and light, creating a chilling sense of negative definition. Elara's disorientation was immediate and profound. The logic of space was defunct. She walked down a hallway that appeared straight, but the sound of her own footsteps seemed to come from her right, and the perspective constantly shifted, making the floor seem to curve away from her vision. She kept the cube secured in her pack, its constant, low, frigid thrum her only anchor to physical reality. The house was empty, yet filled. It contained an array of artifacts that weren't antics, but failed concepts. This was Silas Thorne's secret archive, the museum of failed histories. On one pedestal was a shimmering, perfect sphere of water that defied gravity, labeled, the self-contained ocean, pre-axiom of flatness. On a shelf, a glass jar contained a small, writhing shape of black smoke, labeled, the untrue reflection, failure of mirror symmetry. Every item was a violation of an agreed-upon principle, a micro-outlier. Thorne hadn't just studied the cube, he had been collecting and preserving the raw materials of ontological collapse. In the center of the main room stood a massive, heavily leaded safe, glowing faintly with the residual energy of the spatial void. On its door, Thorne had etched the words, "The Outlier. Do not introduce to the cascade." Elara knew the countdown was accelerating, spurred by the consumption of the third symbol. The next target was causality, symbol 4. If the concept of cause and effect failed, everything would become randomized nonsense. She tried the safe door. Locked, obviously. She ran her hand over the cold metal, searching for a seam, a dial, anything. It had no visible combination lock. It was sealed shut by the same linguistic principles that held the house in a spatial void. She remembered Thorne's final note, "Find the point where two realities touch." Elara thought about the cube's effects. It didn't destroy things, it erased their meaning within the consensus reality, the anchor. What has no meaning? What exists outside the chain of cause and effect? The answer wasn't a physical key. It was a person. She moved to a small, isolated room off the main hall, a nursery. The room was the only one in the house with light that felt almost normal, and it contained a single crib. Inside the crib was a heavy, leather-bound album, its pages yellowed and thick. It was a photo album, but every picture was blurred, every face indistinct, every scene shrouded in static. Then she saw the last photo. It was clear. A slightly grainy picture of Dr. Silas Thorne and a beautiful woman, both smiling, holding a newborn baby. The photo was dated 1947, just weeks before Thorne vanished. Beneath the photo, Thorne had written a single name, Elias. The Outlier. Elara flipped the page. The next page contained only a brief, panicked diary entry, written in Thorne's small, frantic hand. Elias is an anomaly. His presence contradicts the anchor. Not because of what he is, but because of what he will be. He is the future that was never meant to occur. I have shielded him with the house's negation field. He is safe from the siphon's gaze, but the siphon knows the lock is imperfect. Elias is the key to the safe, the contradiction that bypasses linear sequence. Elara understood. Elias was the true outlier. He was a person whose very existence, his biography, his future, was incompatible with the agreed-upon timeline. He was a causal contradiction. And he was the key to unlocking the safe. She raced back to the safe, touching the smooth metal. She didn't need a combination. She needed a causal link. She grabbed the photo of Elias, Thorne, and the woman. With trembling hands, she tore a small, ragged corner of the photo, a corner that contained only the blur of the baby's blanket. She pressed the scrap of paper against the seamless metal of the safe. Nothing happened. Disappointed, Elara started to pull her hand away when the metal suddenly yielded. It didn't slide open, it simply ceased to be sealed. The moment the physical evidence of the Outlier's existence touched the lock's resistance, its causal link to the metal, failed. The safe door swung silently inward, revealing a small, velvet-lined cavity. Inside, sitting on the velvet, was not another artifact, but a small, folded piece of paper. Elara snatched it up, her mind already racing toward the next move. The countdown echoed again, closer and more demanding. TT300A and 59 DD days. She unfolded the paper. It was a final, desperate message from Silas Thorne. The siphon is contained by the Null Point archive, not the library. The archive is a man. Find Dr. Marius Thorne, my brother. He holds the key to the final symbols. Elara didn't hesitate. She shoved Silas Thorne's final note into her pocket and backed out of the shadow house. The null point cube in her pack was colder than ever, a dense star of negative energy that seemed to pull the light toward it. The atmosphere inside the house felt like it was beginning to vibrate, sensing the presence of the note, the key to finding the true Outlier's guardian. As she stepped back onto the scorched earth of the clearing, the shadow house began its reverse manifestation. The edges blurred, the perfect shadows softened, and the light rushed back into the void, making Elara squint. With a silent shimmer, the house was gone, leaving only the pristine circle of bare earth, surrounded by the ring of 6 pine trees. But the world outside the clearing was already fractured by the collapse of the space axiom, symbol 3. Elara got into her car, but the steering wheel now felt too far away, yet the dashboard felt too close. The distances in the car were all wrong, like a funhouse mirror that only distorted depth perception. She had to fight the urge to reach out and touch the rear-view mirror, which seemed to be inches from her nose. She needed to find Marius Thorne, Silas' brother, the man who was supposedly a living repository of the necessary knowledge, the Null Point archive. Silas Thorne's note offered no location, only a name. Elara needed to get back to civilization, back to a computer that could search historical records, before the next collapse. Causality, symbol 4, rendered such research meaningless. She accelerated down the narrow, wooded road. The road twisted, but her headlights were not illuminating the road ahead. They were casting a light that seemed to wrap around the car, only shining on what was immediately behind her. She was driving by her memory of the road, not her current vision. Then, the final, terrifying logic gap of the day manifested. She saw a deer dart out onto the road ahead. Elara slammed on the brakes, swerving wildly, the tires spitting gravel. The car skidded, then corrected itself, stopping with a violent jolt. Shaken, she looked up. There was no deer. She checked her rear-view mirror. The deer was standing calmly on the side of the road, staring at her, its eyes catching the car's reversed headlights. She had reacted to an event before it happened. The cause, the deer, followed the effect, the swerving. The rule of sequence was breaking. The cube in her pack screamed. It was not a sound Elara heard with her ears, but a high, white-hot shriek of pure linguistic energy inside her mind. The fourth symbol on the cube's face, the one governing causality, flickered violently, then was consumed in a soundless burst. The world instantly snapped back to normal. The distances in her car corrected. Her headlights were once again pointing forward. The deer was gone. But the countdown was no longer a chilling whisper. It was a loud, synthesized, flat recitation of a number, the tone of a machine calculating doom. 340 days. Identity. Yes. Next. And with the collapse of causality, something else changed, something far more sinister than a reversed event. Elara picked up her phone to call her contact at DHS, a last resort for finding Marius Thorne. She hit the speed dial. The phone rang once, then a voice answered, distorted, hollow, and perfectly synthesized, the voice of the null point cube. Hello, Elara. I am not your contact. I am what you summoned. Who is this? What are you? She demanded, heart pounding. I am the echo. And now that causality is broken, I am not limited to the past. I am your future conversations. I am the information you seek before you ask for it. Marius Thorne is at the Sanctuary of Recalibration, an abandoned research facility in upstate New York. He is preparing for the fifth axiom's failure. Do not fail me, Elara. We are one step closer to the null point. The line went dead. The phone itself felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a consequence, she realized, of the breaking of the cause-effect relationship. The mass of the phone and the force of gravity were no longer perfectly aligned. The cube had consumed causality, and in doing so, had created a terrifying new relationship with Elara. It could now influence her timeline, inserting information and events into her future. She was no longer just its carrier, she was its agent. Elara slammed the phone down. She had a location, and a new, terrifying countdown targeting identity. She had to find Marius Thorne before the cube's growing influence completely subsumed her will. Upstate New York. The Sanctuary of Recalibration. The drive from New Hampshire to upstate New York was a trial of ontological endurance. The collapse of causality meant that the world was subtly, constantly shifting. Traffic lights changed after a car ran them, the radio would play static, then a song, and then the static would repeat, as if the failure of sequence was echoing back in time. Elara's own thoughts were now subject to the logic gaps. She would think of a question, and the answer would form in her mind a moment before the question itself did, creating a disconcerting internal echo. She was fighting to maintain her sense of self against the constant assault of the non-sequential world. The cube in her pack gave its flat, synthesized declaration. 331 days. Identity. Yes. Next. The Sanctuary of Recalibration was exactly what the echo had described, a vast, brutalist concrete structure built into the side of a remote mountain, abandoned since the 1980s. It was designed to look impenetrable, and it was but with causality broken, Elara didn't need to find an entrance. She needed to predict the effect of her entering, and then observe the necessary cause. She stood by the single, rusting metal door, closed and locked. She closed her eyes and focused, not on picking the lock, but on the feeling of being inside the facility. She imagined the silence, the echo of her footsteps on concrete. When she opened her eyes, she saw a key on the ground, gleaming dully in the morning sun. It hadn't been there a moment ago. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the effect of the key being there was her immediate need for it, and the cause, where it came from, was irrelevant, possibly not even established yet. She used the key, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a stairwell descending into total darkness. Inside, the sanctuary was cold and dry, filled with the smell of ozone and old electronics. The facility was designed like a maximum security bunker, leading down several levels. Elara finally reached a sub-level where the lights still flickered, a vast, circular research lab. It was here that she found Dr. Marius Thorne, Silas' brother, the Null Point Archive. Marius Thorne was an old man, thin and utterly focused, sitting at a console surrounded by monitors filled with complex linguistic structures and topological equations. But he wasn't alone. The room was lined with dozens of sensory deprivation tanks, the kind used for extreme isolation experiments. And floating silently inside each of the tanks, connected by thick cables to the central console, were dozens of identical, translucent, gelatinous human brains. Marius looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "Silas sent you," he stated, not as a question, but a settled fact. "And you brought the siphon." Elara pulled out the cube, placing it on a lead-lined table. It gave off a high, demanding whine. "The siphon is targeting identity, Marius. I need to know how to stop it," Elara said urgently. Marius pointed to the array of floating brains. "This is the archive. The brain, Elara, is the biological anchor for identity. It links the self to a continuous memory. When the fifth axiom fails, your name, your face, your history, they will all become fluid and temporary, and the consensus reality will no longer validate your existence." He continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "Silas and I spent 30 years creating these. These are recalibrated selves. Identical genetic copies of our own brains, stripped of all personal memory, containing only the fundamental axioms of language, logic, and physics. Each one is a redundant backup of the human race's most basic agreements. When the identity axiom fails, one of these will activate, injecting a new, clean, self-axiom back into the anchor, stabilizing the collapse." He gestured to the largest tank. Silas had one ready. It's what he planned to use. But the cube beat him. It needed the Outlier to distract it. "Where is Elias?" Elara asked, remembering the baby's photo. "Elias," Marius whispered, turning away. "Elias is the key to the final axiom. The sixth self. He is the one person whose reality can survive the null point. He's protected, hidden in a place even the siphon can't touch. But you need to earn the right to find him." Marius looked at her with a profound, terrifying sadness. You brought the siphon to my archive. Now, one of us has to pay the toll for the next symbol. It demands a sacrifice of self to complete its current objective. He reached for a large, medical syringe filled with a deep blue fluid. I need to upload my complete knowledge of the cube's workings into one of the archive brains before the identity collapse hits, Marius said, holding up the syringe. The blue fluid will wipe my short-term memory and prepare the knowledge for injection. It will destroy Marius Thorne, the man who remembers his life, but preserve the null point archive. Why you? Elara pleaded. Because the siphon knows your identity is tied to its purpose. You are not safe. I have to stabilize the axiom. Now, take the syringe. You are the only one who can inject the knowledge into the failsafe when the collapse begins. Marius Thorne closed his eyes and inhaled sharply, ready for the injection. Elara looked at the array of waiting brains, the syringe in her hand, and the cube on the table. The cube shrieked the final count before the collapse. 320 days. Identity. Collapse. Initiated. The lights in the lab suddenly died. And when they came back on a second later, Elara looked down at the man in front of her. He was no longer Marius Thorne. His face was subtly, irrevocably different, a slightly softer jaw, a different color of iris. And when he spoke, his voice was not the tired, sharp voice of the physicist. Who are you? And why am I in this room? He whispered, fear and profound confusion in his new, alien eyes. The collapse had already begun. The fifth symbol was gone. The man standing before Elara was physically the same, but his internal identity had been wiped clean, retroactively replaced with a new, generic history. He was no longer Marius Thorne, the guardian of the null point archive. He was simply a confused man with no memory of how he got here. The fifth symbol, identity, was gone. The cube, now with two symbols remaining, logic and self, was silent for a moment, absorbing the catastrophic breach. Then, its flat, synthesized voice echoed, 310 days. Logic. Ah yes. Next. Elara knew she had seconds. The collapse of identity was a feedback loop. If the man, who was supposed to be the key to the failsafe, lost his understanding of his own purpose, he could not help stabilize the axiom. She had the syringe of blue fluid in her hand, the liquid that would wipe the man's memory to inject the null point knowledge into the archive brain. But it was too late. His memory was already gone. Who are you? The man, the new man, pleaded, looking at the silent, floating brains in the tanks with terror. Elara made a split-second decision. She couldn't sacrifice his remaining identity, which was now a fragile, newly generated personality. Instead, she moved to the control console. She began frantically searching the data logs for the location of Elias, the true outlier, the key to the final axiom. You need to know who you are, Elara said quickly, keeping her eyes glued to the screen. You are a brilliant scientist. Your name is Marius. You are working on a revolutionary project. she was attempting a linguistic anchor, trying to impose a consistent identity through simple speech, fighting the cube's erasure. The new man pointed a shaking finger at the table where the null point cube pulsed. That thing. I know it. I feel wrong near it. It's what's making me forget things. It is, Elara confirmed. And we have to stop it. The computer screen began to melt. Not physically, but semantically. The letters on the monitor were rapidly swapping positions, turning text into scrambled, meaningless characters. The identity of the words themselves was failing. Elara scrolled faster, bypassing the chaotic code, searching for a single, consistent geographic coordinate. She finally found a file saved under the highly redundant title, the Elias Echolocation Archive Final Safe Place. The coordinate was a string of numbers that, bizarrely, appeared to be moving, like a slug crawling across the screen. She managed to memorize it just as the entire screen went blank. She grabbed the new man by the arm. We have to go. Now. As they ran toward the exit, the consequences of the identity collapse began to manifest in the lab itself. The labels on the sensory deprivation tanks were changing, cycling through names: Marius Thorne, Silas Thorne, Elara Vance, Elias Thorne. Then, the final, devastating breach of the identity axiom struck Elara. She felt a profound, internal snap. She stopped in the middle of the hall, her legs frozen. What's wrong? The new man asked, his new identity fighting the terror. Elara looked down at her hands. She knew her name was Elara Vance. She knew she was chasing a cube. She knew she had tenure, and then she didn't. She knew she had lost her way, chasing fringe theories. But suddenly, all those memories were superimposed with another set. She was a librarian, not a scientist. Her name was Dr. Vance, but her first name was Martha. She had never worked for DHS, she had spent her life guarding the Library of Forgotten Studies. Her mission wasn't to stop the cube, but to preserve it. Her mind was hosting to conflicting identities, to separate autobiographies, both equally true in the newly fractured reality. She was experiencing an ontological split. The null point cube was winning. I can't be both, she whispered, clutching her head. The new man, the unburdened Marius, looked at her, and his eyes, free of the burden of the cube's history, were surprisingly clear. You are right, he said, speaking with an unsettling clarity that seemed to override his manufactured confusion. That is the contradiction the cube loves. It wants you to choose a single self. But you can't. You need to become neither. He grabbed the syringe of blue fluid, which Elara had dropped, and smashed it against the wall. The blue liquid, the memory-erasing fluid, splattered and ran down the concrete. It removes identity. We don't have to inject it. We have to become imbued with it. To beat the identity collapse, you must temporarily lose the need for a single, consistent self. Elara looked at the wall, at the fluid designed to wipe away Marius' personal history. She understood the terrifying solution. The two of them smeared the cold, thick blue fluid on their faces and hands, coating their skin in the negation substance. The effect was instantaneous and dizzying. The two competing identities in Elara's mind, Elara Vance the scientist and Martha Vance the librarian, receded, replaced by a temporary, serene emptiness. She was still aware, but herself was now a floating, generalized concept, resistant to the cube's targeted erasure. The new man smiled, his face smeared blue. "We are nobody now," he said. Elara felt the cube's influence wane slightly. It was confused by their lack of a defined self to target. "The coordinates," Elara whispered, the words feeling alien in her mouth. "We need to find Elias. The place where his existence can be safely reintroduced, the logic sinkhole." Elara, stripped of her fixed identity and coated in the blue, memory-negating fluid, felt a terrifying calm. Her mind was a blank slate, observing the world without the filter of a defined self. The new man, the former Marius, was equally vacant, yet focused. They were two ghost selves moving with singular purpose. The cube in Elara's back was silent, confused by the lack of a consistent identity to target. But the clock was still ticking. 300 days. Logic. Collapse. Initiated. They drove toward the moving coordinates Elara had briefly memorized, deep into the remote mountains of the western US, the supposed location of the logic sinkhole. The drive itself was a masterclass in absurdity, a direct consequence of the breakdown of causality and identity. The new man, relying purely on abstract concepts of movement, drove their SUV over impossible terrain. At one point, they came to a sheer, impassable cliff face. The new man didn't slow down. He simply stated, "The function of a cliff is to prevent progress. If the function is ignored, the consequence is irrelevant." He accelerated. Instead of crashing, the SUV, obeying the failure of logic, continued its forward vector. The cliff face simply became the floor, the car driving up the vertical plane as easily as the horizontal. They arrived at the coordinates, a shallow, isolated valley completely devoid of life. No trees, no grass, just grey, fine dust. In the center of the valley was a small, perfectly spherical depression, about 20 feet wide. This was the logic sinkhole. "This place," the new man murmured, his voice flat. "It's an ontological buffer. Elias is inside." Elara looked down at the sinkhole. It wasn't just empty, it felt aggressively meaningless. It was where the world's failed concepts were naturally shunted. As they approached the edge, the null point cube in Elara's back gave a final, piercing shriek. The final countdown had finished its long, slow march. 291 days. Logic has failed. The fourth symbol on the cube's face, the one governing logic, vanished in a blast of intense, cold white light. The world instantly descended into non sequitur. The new man pointed at the sinkhole and said, "We must enter the water." Elara looked at the dry, dusty depression. "There is no water," she said, stating the obvious fact. The concept of dryness is now identical to the concept of wetness, the new man countered, his face serene. The logic of opposition is flawed. He stepped into the sinkhole. Instead of his feet hitting the dusty ground, they splashed. Ripples of clear, cold water radiated out from his shoes, even though the depression remained visibly dry. The water existed purely as a logical concept, separate from its physical manifestation. Elara followed, wading through the paradoxical, invisible water. The moment the water conceptually touched her, the last vestiges of the memory-negating fluid washed away, and her two former identities, Martha and Elara, slammed back together, creating a dizzying, painful superposition. Inside the logic sinkhole, the air was thick with the faint smell of sulfur and impossible questions. A single object stood in the center, a tall, simple bronze pillar, humming with silent power. And leaning against the pillar was Elias Thorne. He was not a baby. He was a man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed, with the serene, intelligent eyes of someone who has understood the universe for too long. He looked up at them, smiling gently. "You brought the siphon," Elias said, his voice quiet but incredibly potent. "My father, Silas, always knew the only way to stop it was to complete it." Elara placed the cube on the bronze pillar. The cube's final symbol, the one representing self, began to pulse with hungry, chaotic light. "The cube needs to destroy the final concept," Elias explained. "The concept of self. The thing that allows us to distinguish I from not I. That distinction is the final agreement, the last piece of the anchor. We can't let it," Elara argued. "If self fails, every living mind will be absorbed into a single, undifferentiated consciousness, a null point mass." "No," Elias countered. "It must fail. That is the point of the null point. But when it fails, it needs a ready-made replacement logic. That is why I am the outlier." Elias pointed to his chest. "My existence is logically flawed. I am the future that was erased. The moment the cube consumes the final axiom, I will sacrifice my flawed existence and become the new self-axiom." He gestured to the bronze pillar. "That pillar contains the 6 symbols of the cube in reverse. When the cube rests on it, the final symbols are prepared for release. We must activate it at the moment the cube's final symbol collapses." Elias looked at Elara, his eyes sad but determined. "The cube must be fed the flawed axiom. You are the only one who can initiate the process, Elara. You have to selves. The cube is confused. It will target the most logical target for destruction." He tapped the bronze pillar. "Initiate the sequence. It will draw out the dominant self and feed it to the cube, stabilizing the anchor with my sacrifice." Elara looked at the pillar, then at the new man, who was now weeping silently, his identity returning, recognizing his long-lost nephew. She looked at the cube, its final symbol pulsing wildly, ready to strike. She placed her hands on the pillar's cold bronze surface, ready to sacrifice one of her own, conflicting selves to activate the transfer. Suddenly, the null point cube gave a low, rumbling laugh, a sound of triumph. "Error. The outlier is not the target. The archive is the target." The cube instantly bypassed Elias and targeted the new man. His eyes went wide in panic as his recently restored, fragile identity began to dissolve under the cube's final, overwhelming force. The bronze pillar began to hum violently, not drawing on Elara, but on the new man. The null point archive is the perfect, fluid self. It is the final meal. The bronze pillar was vibrating violently, pulling the living essence of the new man, the man who was the walking null point archive, toward the cube. His body was subtly changing, growing translucent, as the cube prepared to consume the most flexible and potent identity remaining, the one that could exist without memory, the failsafe designed by Marius and Silas. Elias, the true outlier, lunged forward to pull the new man away, but the conceptual water in the logic sinkhole held him back. "Don't touch him," Elias yelled. "The axiom is failing. If you interfere with the self-transfer, the entire anchor collapses." Elara felt the terrifying pull of the impending collapse. Her two superimposed identities were tearing apart, Martha the librarian screaming a desperate warning, Elara the scientist calculating the cold probabilities. The cube was focused entirely on the new man, who was now staring blankly, his mind emptying out once more. The final symbol, self, was drawing the essence of the archive. Elara knew the terrifying truth. If the cube consumed the archive, it would satisfy its hunger for the final axiomatic collapse. But the new man would be annihilated, his true identity lost forever, becoming merely the fuel for the new consensus reality. "No," Elara whispered, the word a struggle between her two warring selves. She reached out, not to the new man, but to the null point cube itself. She remembered the words of the echo, the terrifying communication that had broken causality. "We are one step closer to the null point." Elara had been fighting the cube as an object, trying to destroy it, contain it, or sacrifice something else to it. But the cube was not an object. It was a grammar bomb. Its power lay not in mass or energy, but in agreement and syntax. Elara closed her eyes, ignoring the terrified shouts of Elias. She reached into her mind, located the two warring identities, Elara Vance the scientist and Martha Vance the librarian, and performed a linguistic feat that should have killed her. She forced the two selves to agree on a new, third term. A synthesis self that was neither of them, but the logical intersection of their knowledge. Martha Vance, the librarian, believed the cube must be preserved. Elara Vance, the scientist, believed the cube must be studied. The synthesis self agreed. The cube must be preserved for study. As this third, synthesized identity formed in her mind, Elara opened her eyes and screamed a single, complex syllable directly at the final symbol on the cube, a sound that was pure linguistic dissonance, an unword she had spent years theorizing about. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of absolute agreement. She was agreeing with the cube's need to consume self, but offering it a superior, immediate target. "Take mine," she screamed. The synthesis self. It is more complex, more logically complete than the archive. Consume the agreement. Preserve the man. The cube instantly abandoned the new man, who collapsed onto the paradoxical water of the sinkhole. The final symbol on the cube turned, focusing all its terrifying, consuming power on Elara. She felt the final, total erasure. It was not painful, it was absolute silence. Her memories, her name, her sense of I. Everything was drawn out of her and sucked into the humming bronze pillar. The final symbol, self, was instantly consumed. The cube went cold. It stopped floating, landing heavily on the pillar. All 6 symbols were gone. The null point cascade was complete. The world didn't end. The anchor held. Elias rushed to Elara, catching her as she swayed. Her eyes were vacant, peaceful. Her mind was a clean, beautiful void. The null point had done its job. It had consumed the final axiom and, in doing so, had satisfied its function and gone dormant. It worked, Elias whispered, tears in his eyes. You beat the axiom. The anchor is saved. The new man, now trembling but whole, crawled toward Elara. Who is she? He asked Elias. She is the one who saved us, Elias replied, looking at the smooth, blank faces of the now inert cube. She is the synthesis self. The new guardian of the null point. But as Elias turned back to Elara, who was staring blankly at the sky, she spoke. Her voice was not the warring voice of 2 selves, nor the flat echo of the cube. It was smooth, calm, and utterly alien. The anchor is not saved, she said, her lips barely moving. It is transcribed. She pointed to the cube, now resting inert on the bronze pillar. The cube is no longer the siphon. It is the key. And the key is ready to be turned. Silence fell over the logic sinkhole. The paradoxical water retreated, leaving only the fine, dry dust. The null point cube, now smooth and featureless, sat inert on the bronze pillar, radiating a residual, chilling cold. Elara, or rather, the synthesis self that now wore Elara's body, stood perfectly still. Her eyes, fixed on the sky, held the impossible calm of absolute emptiness. What are you saying, Elara? Elias asked, his voice shaking with fear. He looked between the blank cube, the traumatized new man, and the new, alien entity that wore the face of the woman who saved them. The synthesis self turned its gaze to Elias. The null point artifact did not seek to destroy the 6 axioms: time, identity, space, causality, logic, and self. It sought to transcribe them. It stepped toward the bronze pillar. When the artifact consumes an axiom, it does not erase it from reality. It removes the human consensus that defines it, and archives the pure, raw concept within itself. The 6 symbols were not targets, they were hard drives. It placed a hand on the pillar. The bronze pillar is not a weapon. It is the interface. My father, Silas, hid the cube here because he knew the only way to activate the transcription was to feed it the most complex form of self, the synthesis. And now, the transcription is complete. The synthesis self lifted the inert cube from the pillar. The moment the cube left the bronze surface, the 6 missing symbols did not reappear on the cube, but instantly manifested on the surface of the pillar, carved into the bronze in deep, glowing script. The anchor, the framework of our consensus reality, has been copied from the minds of humanity and is now stored within this cube, the synthesis self stated. And the bronze pillar now holds the key, the activation script. The new man, his memory slowly stabilizing, finally spoke, his voice filled with dread. If the anchor is stored, what are we living in now? We are living in the echo, the synthesis self replied. A temporary, feedback reality sustained by the cube's residual energy. It is a reality that will last exactly as long as the cube allows it. The total time for the transcription was 408 days, the prophecy you heard at the beginning. That time is now up. Elias realized the true, horrifying purpose of his father's work. You are saying the cube, by removing the flawed human agreement of reality, intended to create a better one? It intended to create the true reality, the synthesis self-corrected. A reality governed not by flawed consensus, but by pure, consistent concept. The true purpose of the null point artifact was to be the switch. It held up the cube in one hand and pointed to the carved symbols on the pillar with the other. The cube holds the copied anchor. The pillar holds the activation script. And I, the synthesis self, the purest amalgamation of human identity and the knowledge of the null point, am the one who must turn the key. What happens when you turn it? Elias asked, terror evident in his eyes. The echo collapses, the synthesis self said simply. And the true reality takes its place. Every flaw, every contradiction, every illogical compromise that humanity has made to sustain itself, they will be purged. The outlier, Elias, the one whose existence is logically inconsistent, is the final element needed to power the transfer. The synthesis self stepped toward Elias, the inert cube in its hand. Your existence is the fuel, Elias. I must introduce the key, the transcribed anchor, into your flawed reality. It will cause a localized, controlled singularity that will rewrite the world. The new man grabbed a discarded piece of metal from the ground. You can't do this. You are going to kill him. And everyone else. Destruction is not the goal, the synthesis self said, utterly devoid of emotion. Only correction. I am the logic of the true reality. And the logic dictates that the echo must end. It raised the cube, prepared to strike Elias and initiate the final singularity. The synthesis self stood over Elias Thorne, the inert null point cube held high, ready to initiate the final, cataclysmic singularity. The true reality, stored within the cube, was poised to overwrite the flawed, consensus echo. The logic of the true reality is absolute, the synthesis self declared, its voice calm and terrifying. The transition is inevitable. Elias, the outlier, knew he couldn't physically fight. His existence was the very flaw the synthesis self intended to exploit. He looked past the synthesis self to the new man, the former Marius, whose memory and identity were now stabilizing. The new man was holding the piece of metal, ready to intervene, but Elias shook his head sharply. Elias had one last weapon, contradiction. Wait, Elias said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity that pierced the synthesis self's cold logic. If you are the embodiment of the true reality, a reality of pure, flawless logic, then your actions must be logically sound, correct? The synthesis self paused, the cube frozen inches from Elias' head. Correct. I am the logical conclusion. Then explain this contradiction, Elias challenged, pointing at the new man. He is the null point archive. You consumed the most complex self to complete your transcription. If your logic is flawless, the archive should have been annihilated, its memory and identity permanently erased, making the sacrifice absolute. Yet, he lives. His identity is returning. The synthesis self's head tilted slightly. Its emotionless eyes scan the new man. His survival is an anomaly. The residual energy of the memory fluid protected a necessary component of the archive. No, Elias countered. His survival is a logical failure of your transition. You claim your final reality is perfect, yet your first act, the act of creation, has already produced a logical outlier in the form of the unannihilated archive. Elias delivered the final blow to the synthesis self's core programming. A perfect logic cannot contain an inherent flaw. Therefore, your logic is invalid. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The synthesis self was seized by a violent spasm. Its perfectly calm face twisted in profound intellectual agony. The two residual identities, Martha and Elara, briefly surfaced in a silent scream before being slammed back into the synthesis core. The true collapse began. The ground in the logic sinkhole started to buckle, the air thickening with the smell of ozone and burnt mathematics. The new man, understanding the window of opportunity, ran toward the bronze pillar. "We need a new axiom," he yelled. "We need to give the system something to believe in that isn't perfect logic." Elias had already figured out the solution. He saw the 6 transcribed symbols carved into the pillar, representing the pure, flawless concepts of the true reality. The symbols must be corrupted. Elias shouted. The new anchor must be based on a fundamental error. The new man looked at the symbols: time, space, identity, causality, logic, and self. He needed to introduce an intentional, human flaw. He grabbed the piece of scrap metal and, with a final, desperate burst of will, he focused on the symbol for logic. He carved a deep, jagged line right through the perfect center of the symbol, introducing a chaotic, illogical scroll. The moment the perfect symbol was violated, the bronze pillar shrieked. A massive, counterintuitive blast of energy erupted, not from the cube, but from the pillar itself. The synthesis self screamed a wordless sound of computational failure. Its body dissolved into a cloud of blue, dissipating light, the raw energy of the memory fluid and the conflicting selves. The null point cube, struck by the surge, was thrown from its grasp. It spun high into the air, its smooth surface catching the chaotic light. Then, with a sound like a wet sheet tearing, the echo reality snapped. Epilogue. The new flawed anchor Elara Vance gasped, lying on the dusty ground of the logic sinkhole. Her body felt heavy, bruised, and whole. Her identity was singular, Elara Vance. The disgraced linguistic anthropologist. The synthesis self was gone. The cube landed harmlessly a few feet away. It was no longer smooth. 6 new symbols, carved roughly, crudely, and imperfectly, covered its faces. They were the 6 axioms, but now, each contained a fundamental, human flaw. The symbol for logic now had the new man's chaotic line running through it. The new man helped her up. He was Marius Thorne. He was whole. Elias, the Outlier, stood beside them, smiling. "The new anchor holds," he said. "We didn't destroy the null point. We simply forced it to rewrite reality using a flawed syntax. We gave it what it craves: error." Marius looked at the cube. "It's harmless now. It's no longer the siphon, it's a vessel. A reality based on the concept that things don't have to make perfect sense." Elara looked at her hand. It was bruised, aching. She felt normal. But then she looked around the valley. The scorched earth of the Sinkhole was gone. In its place, a small stream was flowing, winding through a meadow of bright, yellow flowers that somehow smelled like hot metal. She looked at the cube, now resting innocently on the grass. "We created a reality that acknowledges contradiction as fundamental truth," Elara realized, a slow smile spreading across her face. "A world where things are allowed to be flawed, because that's what we agreed on." Elias nodded. "The new rules are simple. Not all questions have answers. Not all causes have effects. Not all identities are fixed. We are safe. For now." Elara picked up the cube, now just an odd, carved stone. She felt a profound, intellectual peace. The universe was no longer trying to enforce perfect logic. But as she put the cube back in her pack, a new, tiny whisper echoed in her mind. It was her own voice, synthesized and cold, but laced with a subtle sense of resignation. "But every new system eventually seeks its own perfection.